Hi, everybody. So, tonight's going to be a little bit different. We're going to try something a little off key. It's not going to be my story. It's not going to be a story that I have for when I was trucking around in North America for 30 years. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to tell you a story from the small village, the area where I grew up in northern New Brunswick. This story is about the headless nun of the French Fort Cove. So back in the mid 1800s, the 18th century, so this would be the 1700s, there was a nun, a story of, she was Acadian. That's the original French Canadians. They were all brought to the French Fort Cove ahead of the British kind of a movement where the British gathered all the Acadians and expelled them. And this is where the Acadians or the Cajuns come from in Louisiana, southern Mississippi. It's where all the French and the Gulf Coast comes from. They're actually Acadians from this area of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island. So what they did was they gathered them all up. Now, the nun in question, the story is about a sister called Sister Marie Inconnu. Now, Inconnu in French is unknown, translates to unknown. They didn't know her last name. It is what it is. It was the 18th century, and the records are pretty sparse back then about anything. So there's kind of two stories on how this goes. There's the story on the web of Sister Marie. She late one night, she's returning, and she was assisting somebody that was very ill. Don't know what the illness was. It was and that time and this era at this location, it could have been from bad water. I mean, it could be anything. It's cholera was big. In Europe, cholera killed more people than the royalty, and that's saying a lot. So she was set upon by robbers, is in the one you read on the internet, and they beat her severely, wanting to know where the buried money was. This money from all these Acadians and all that, and she wouldn't give it up. So they ended up beating her and eventually cut her head off and wandered off with the head. Hence, that's where she apparently started out the headless nun. Now, there's another story where a trapper was in the woods and would only come out with his furs, and he'd been a couple years in the bush and went mad. And when he came out, he wanted to take her back. It was the whole ordeal. And he ended up killing and beheading Sister Marie and took her head with him. He was never saw again. The story goes on. And he had eventually just ended up, they say, going back in the woods and living there until he died. It is what it is. So there's another story with Sister Marie, but the sister, it's always Sister Marie, and she was always known as Sister Marie Unknown or Inconnu. It's kind of a local legend at this point. So the third one is there was privateers, sailors, came up the river when they docked and ported, and they had gone to this area, hearing that predecessors had buried treasures, or that the local convent or nunnery, the area, the Catholics were quite rich, and they had all different kinds of wealth and stuff like that. So Sister Marie was walking back again from being in a house where the family, the mother was terribly ill, and was set upon by these sailors. Now, they beat and abused Sister Marie quite a long while before, and she again wouldn't give up the location of these riches, these so-called treasure that these sailors were convinced she had. So they beheaded her, kind of punishment, and they took her head on the boat and sailed back out and threw the head into the ocean. And so she was cursed to wander the French Fort Cove, always looking for her head. Kind of an Ichabod Crane feel to it there for a little bit. Now, there is ghost walks in the French Fort Cove. There's people that do have them, and you can go on one. And there's people that swear they've seen a floating light up and down the trail, main trail of the French Fort Cove. Not saying it is, not saying it's not. Everybody has their own truth. Like, I mean, there's people, the ones that say they've seen it, they firmly believe they've seen it, and that's grand, and that's what it is. There's other people that, say there's nothing there and it's just a tale. But the thing with this podcast and my website is, if you want to believe it, it's out there. It is out there. There is different truths, or I don't know if you want to call them truths, but there's different legends and stories and all this other stuff. There's also a story of the Dungarvon Hooper, which comes from towards Blackville. It's another small community up in northern New Brunswick. It's kind of a funny story. So the Dungarvon Hooper, it's a sound, and people swear it's the sound of a ghost that is mourning a death of a loved one. So, you hear this big moaning sound. Now, I have heard that, and it's creepy. You're out in the middle of the woods, and I mean, it's a beautiful area, famous for Atlantic salmon fly fishing. And you're standing out in the middle of the woods by the Dungarvon River, and everything's quiet and everything's grand, and all of a sudden you hear, whoa, and you're like, what is that? And it literally, like, it makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, or the mustache, whichever way you want to go with that. But it's a sound that is not easily forgotten by any stretch of the imagination. Once you hear it once, it is there permanently. You will always remember it. There is other sounds that go along with that. I mean, people would say, "Oh, well, it's a bird, or it's the wind," and it could be the wind. I'm not saying it's not the wind. It could definitely be the wind. What I'm telling you is, I've heard it years ago, about 100 pounds lighter. I was on a dirt bike. Went back there. I'd heard it before. I went back there, and I camped back there. I was going to hear it again, and I was going to figure it out. I never heard it again. Never figured it out. I heard it the once, plain as could be. Never heard it again. I know people that swear up and down they've heard it 3 or 4 times. That's not me. I heard it once. And the story goes with the Dungarvon Hooper is it was a young Irish cook. And this is kind of weird because his name was Ryan. So when they came over from Ireland, it was O'Ryan. Now, my family is Irish, Scottish, and Italian. We were O'Ryans, O'Driscolls is another, they're cousins. But O'Ryans were from Southern Ireland, County Cork, actually. My great-grandmother was from Scotland. She was from the Orkney Islands, and she was a Smith Anderson. So our family were Scandinavian that invaded Scotland. They were Vikings, and they came to the Orkney Islands looking for land, whatever. So the Irish side of me kind of feels for this lad, this young cook, and he moves. So he was a cook in a lumber camp, and back in the day they stayed seasonally in the lumber camps and they floated the logs down rivers and big log flumes, and so the lumber camp was close to the Dungarvon River, and when he went to cook, he brought all his possessions, as most young lads did. I mean, it wasn't like he was carrying bundles of suitcases and a backpack. He probably showed up with what was on his back and a few personal items that his mom gave him, or his dad gave him, or grandmother. It was whoever, like a loved one, would have gave him something to remember them by, and so it was good. But with him, he had a money belt. He had a plan. The plan was he was going to save all his money, while he was working in the camp and that, and while they were out, the lumberjacks and everything else, he was the cook, so he was left alone with the boss. The boss of the camp looked after everything. He had to keep his log count. He had to keep, payroll, everything, and that was, well, the boss knew that this young Ryan had a money belt with him and that he had been saving his money. So while everybody was out, the boss decides to murder this young Ryan. And for nothing less than a few bucks. Or, well, today would have been, back then would have been pennies. It would have been a few dollars today. It was, certainly not worth somebody's life. Well, the crew returns, and they liked the young Ryan. He was a cook, and they sat around, told stories, and they were, back then here on where I grew up, it was all Irish, French, Acadian. My wife's with us tonight, by the way. That's my wife right there. But they were all Irish, Acadian, Scottish. They wasn't really, like, the crowd here wasn't big on the English. Let's just put it that way. I mean, you had the Irish that hated the English monarchy. You had the Scottish who weren't happy with them, and the French most certainly weren't happy with them. So they returned. The crew returned. So the boss concocts a story that this young Ryan took sick. Now, this is all in one working shift. Took sick and died. Don't know what it was. Came on extraordinarily fast. Oh, he was terribly sick and he died. Bang, done. So the crew, they gave him an Irish burial. They gave him a burial. Now, a lot of these men, especially the French, were Catholic, staunch Roman Catholic. The Acadians being French, there was no French Protestants back in the day, back when this was taking place. They would have been called Huguenots, and the Catholic Church in France did everything to exterminate the Huguenots in 12 something. It was way before this. So them being Catholic, and they gave him a good burial marker. And somebody read from the Bible over him, like it would have been good. But they buried it. They buried the body away from the camp because they were told he'd become sick and had passed away suddenly. But then after that, after they buried him, is when this whooping started. This moaning, this dreadful mourning sound, and it persisted. And it persisted to the point where they couldn't fall asleep at night. Like, nobody was getting any sleep. Now, back in the day, they were a lot more superstitious than we are today. You know, we have scientists and that, and I'm still pretty superstitious. But back then, the men were really superstitious. And they firmly believed it was the ghost of this young Ryan coming back to haunt them. So the only reason why a ghost would haunt anybody back in the day was because of a wrong. So they started questioning the camp boss. What happened? Oh, he got sick and he died. The men started not to believe that because young Ryan was coming back because of a perceived wrong of whatever. But the men knew the boss was lying to them. So a couple of mornings after that, the boss wakes up and there's nobody there. It's all by himself. The men left the log camp. They just picked up their axes, picked up their saws, picked up their gear, and tramped out of the woods going home. They'll go logging somewhere else. And the Hooper, that's one of the stories. That's the most popular story of the Dungarvon Hooper and where it came from. But the whooping sound, they say you can still hear it to this day. But maybe it's still young Ryan looking to come out and wants somebody to know that he was murdered for his money belt. Well, I don't know. I know I heard it back in, I think it was 1984. I was up there and heard it. My wife and I were on my dirt bike all through that area and never heard it again. I heard it the one time and I never heard it again. Now, these two stories are right from where I come from, right here. There is more stories up here of I guess you'd call them ghost stories. The Sheep House Falls in different areas. There's a story of the Cape Mouchot lady from Cape Breton. And there's a story of the HMS Atlantic that sank off the coast of Nova Scotia. Now, there are two stories that we'll talk about in a podcast to come. But that's the Dungarvon Hooper and the headless nun of the French Fork Cove. Tomorrow, I'm going to post a video on YouTube again of the Desert Dweller, the second story of my travels throughout North America. Anyways, gang, I hope you enjoyed this, and be well. We'll see you later. Bye.